Right, right, wrong. Greater light, greater light, greater light. That intro, once again, when you look at that, you see the blood cells, the eyes, they look like eyes to you. They're blood. That's a blood. That's blood. Look, power in the blood. That's a sickle blood. There's an artery going across that looks like a rainbow. Just one moment. Oh, wow, they didn't mean to call me. An artery that looked like a rainbow, and then a blood pallet, another a platelet. Huh? See? Oh, yeah. That's just for those who didn't know. Those who didn't know. All right, let's get started. So today I'm going to start off with um, back to foolproof. Foolproof. Sander Vendor Linden. Now, if you want to, you could go back to like 5 videos before where I did about the author so you can understand what my perception is of who he is and how I feel like what I'm dealing with as I read. As I read his writings, I don't see him as a scholar more than a problem. He's one of the problems. A man stood in front of me today and told me that. He said, "You're the problem, huh? You're the problem. You're out here singing about Jesus on the 25th." And I said, "I'm not saying nothing about the 25th. I don't know nothing about the 25th. I'm just singing love and light." Yep. But I'm gonna keep reading, huh? Because I may be wrong, huh? I don't know nothing. I don't know anything. I'm not like Solomon. Solomon was so wise, he rejected God all the way to his death. He said, "I don't want none of what you got. I want the demons. I want my wives. I want my concubines. Huh? I don't want you, God." God came to him 2 times and he was wise, huh? So I realized I don't know. I don't want no wisdom. Don't give me wisdom, huh? Mm-hmm. Then people be reading all his stuff like it's bond. The Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, is bond. Which one of the demons wrote it for him? Huh? Solomon would not turn back from God. He wouldn't turn back to God. He wouldn't run back. Like commission running back to you. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. I wanted to share something. A couple of my videos. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna spend one day this week going through all of my shorts. Not my short shorts. We wear short shorts. No, not that. I'm talking about my YouTube shorts, y'all. If you are YouTube streaming, you know what a YouTube short is. Huh? Some of these streams, I realized where I went wrong. That was my grandson. He wasn't even a year yet. Playing through the phone. He loved that intro. That's why I used that intro the most. And he had his own little 2 steps with it too. That's his fingers. That ain't mine. Look at them little fingers. That's him playing with that phone like that. Yeah. I'm gonna spend the day one day next week going through these prophetic, not prophecy, because all this stuff was here before I got here, but the promise of God. uh, I saw one that I did. I forgot all about this one right here. Look at this. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. What was I doing back then? Huh? Talking about the quest of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Huh? Something triggered in my mind when I did that. And then I put them live right now. I want to know what date I did this. I know it's sometime at the beginning of the year or last year. Look at that. 500 years, million years to make. Oh, I'm not sharing the screen if y'all even know what I'm talking about. My bad. That's in my short. Not in my shorts. In the YouTube. Hold on. You're talking, y'all can't even see what it is I'm talking about. My bad. Okay, okay, okay. Let me go ahead and read. I can't read. What's his face? Sander Vindelin. I'll go over my shorts a little later. Let me start with chapter 4. Now, the end of chapter 3 was about the conspiracy effect. So, fake news antigen 3, identify and resist the 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking. Conspiracy theories are psychologically appealing because they offer certain and simple explanations of otherwise seemingly random and complex events and restore a false sense of control. Ooh, the control freaks. Like I'm reading this for my healing. I even have the people to this day in the church. All I'm doing is fixing grits. And the mothers say, "You're very controlling. You're bossy." I have to work on that. If I have elder sweet women telling me I'm bossy, it's something. And that became part of the attachment to me being a conspiracy theorist. Huh? Conspiracy theories are psychologically appealing because they offer certain and simple explanations of otherwise seemingly random and complex events and restore a false sense of self-control. No, a false sense of control. Conspiracy theories are highly contagious. Their effects rub off on people even after a single exposure. I was rubbing conspiratorial germs all over the place. Identifying them as the first step to building resistance. Identifying them is the first step to building resistance. You can use the conspire test to your advantage. Look out for contradictory logic, overriding suspicion, nefarious intentions. Something must be wrong. Persecuted victim, immune to defense, and reinterpreting random events into a connected story. Ooh, ooh, I had it bad. Ooh, I had it bad. If you want to test your advantage and know that you're in a web of a disease, a virus called conspire, look out for these things one more time before I go to chapter 4. Contradictory logic. Heal me, sound mind in the name of Jesus. Overriding suspicion. Heal me right now in the name of Jesus. I ain't talking to nobody else, huh? For those, I don't want to call it an AA meeting. And it's nothing like that. Because it's not meant for you to stay here and become part of an occult. It is for you to go and spread the message and don't form no cults. Just help people along the way. Pass it on. Contradictory logic, overriding suspicion, nefarious intentions. Something must be wrong. Persecuted victim, immune to evidence, and reinterpreting random events into a connected story. Chapter 4. Why the virus won't leave your mind. The continued influence of misinformation. For the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it. Even after it has been nailed down, a fact which is known to all expert liars in this world and to all who conspire together in the art of lying. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf, 1925. In 2016, I was living and working in Princeton, New Jersey. Princeton is not too far from Woodbridge Township, a bedroom suburb of New York City, about an hour to the northeast of Jersey. The town is a home to the Woodbridge High School, an average U.S. public high school. I thought I have heard about the place where it, I wouldn't have heard about the place were it not for a local story about the history teacher, Jason Ali, who was fired after it became clear that he had his students question the Holocaust. Through presenting series of essays such as Through presenting a series of essays with titles such as A Gas Chamber Full of Lies, Ali believed that he was motivating his students to engage in critical thinking about historical events. The lawsuit that followed included excerpts of pieces written by students under his instruction, including one which struck me in particular. The student explained how they had been taught that Hitler's actions against Jews were brutal and occurred for no apparent reason, but should they not question the idea that Jews were totally innocent? The students asked in a rhetorical tone whether Jews did not crash Germany's economy. Did they not criticize Christianity, introduce pornography to the world? The rather horrid conclusion of the students' essays was that although nobody deserves to die, the Holocaust wasn't unjustified either. Apparently, Jews had it coming. Ooh. Hey, y'all, I'm reading from the book FoolProof. From our discussion in the previous chapter, we're able to recognize this is a clear conspiracy theory, one that dates back to the Second World War itself. Although conspiracy theories seem more relevant than ever in today's post-truth media environment, they were also extremely popular during the war. One of the most common and outrageous conspiracy theories is that Jews started the war in an attempt to destroy Germany. This theory formed the basis of widespread propaganda campaign, which claimed that Germany was under siege by a dangerous international Jewry, and that the country therefore had no recourse other than to defend itself by going to war. The poster below from 1943 vividly illustrates this idea. It was designed by Hans Schweitzer, who was hired by Joseph Goebbels as the Reich Commissioner of Artistic Design to produce Nazi propaganda. The poster blames Jews for the war and reads, "The war is his fault." Unfortunately, Hitler was not wrong when he wrote in Mein Kampf that the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down. As Jason Ali's case illustrates, the false conspiracy theory or colossal untruth is still with us today and remains popular with many modern-day Holocaust deniers. But it's not just the Holocaust denial. We now know that misinformation lives on the leaves, observable trait. I'm all over the place tonight. That's okay. I'm going to take my time. But it's not just Holocaust denial. We now know that misinformation lives and leaves observable traces behind in the brain's memory network. We call it the continued influence of misinformation. The continued influence of misinformation. We'll return to the continued influence of Nazi propaganda on the modern day attitudes. But first, to grasp the basic psychology at work, let's consider a completely fictional example. Imagine for a moment that you turn on the news and you hear about a local fire. Breaking now on January 25th at 8:58 p.m., an alarm call was received from the premises of a wholesale warehouse company. A serious out-of-control fire was reported in the storage hall, requiring an instant response. Immediately after 9 p.m., a fire engine was dispatched. It turns out that the alarm was raised by a night security guard who had smelled smoke and decided to investigate the matter. In the morning of January 26 at 4 a.m., the attendant fire captain suspects that the fire was started by a short circuit in the wiring of a closet in the main storage hall. Update, 4:30 a.m. Police investigator says that they have reports that cans of oil paint and pressurized gas cylinders have been found in the closet before the fire. Firefighters on the scene reported thick, oily smoke and sheets of flames hampering their efforts. Intense heat made the fire particularly difficult to control. Several explosions occurring during the blaze, endangering firefighters in the vicinity. No fatalities were reported, but 2 firefighters have been taken to the hospital as a result of breathing in toxic fumes. Reports say that the small fire had been discovered on the same premises 6 months prior, but local workers were able to contain the incident in time. Although the premises were insured, the owner says that the damages will exceed hundreds of thousands of dollars. Update, 10:40 a.m. Police investigator Lucas has more information regarding the investigation of the fire. The closet reportedly contained cans of oil and paint gas cylinders that had actually been emptied before the fire. The shipping supervisor had disclosed the storage hall contained bales of paper, mailing envelopes, pencils, and other school supplies. Update, 11:30 a.m. The fire captain reports that the fire is out, but the storage hall has been completely gutted. Now let me ask you this. What is most likely the cause of the fire? What was in the storage hall? How was the fire started? This is what participants were asked after reading the above story. See, now I already done concluded or concocted something in my mind. I imagine that the security guard started the fire. I did. So I'm going to read on, but that's what I've come up with. So let's see. This is what the participants were asked after reading the above story in the seminal misinformation experiment conducted by 2 psychologists at the University of Michigan in 1994. Having read the story in 13 staggered messages, like breaking news reports, participants were invited to freely write out their thoughts to answer these as well as some other factual questions. However, in just one of the conditions, the correction group, who were presented the story exactly as it appears above, the participants learned that the closet reportedly containing cans of oil and paint gas cylinders had actually been empty before the fire. No reference whatsoever was made to this incorrect claim in the control group. It was simply stated that the closet in the warehouse hall was empty. In other words, only the correction group were provided with an updated and new information about the oil and gas cans. The researchers then tested people's episodic memory, episodic referring to memories of everyday events, such as time and location, that people can consciously retrieve. In order to do this, researchers coded people's written responses. For example, memories were evaluated based on how often people made reference to the correction, or how often they invoked themes about the origin of the fire in their answers, as well as directed references in stored chemicals. The findings were striking. In several experiments, 91 to 95% of participants in the correction group made at least one direct and undisputed reference to the chemical materials from the storage room when questioned about the event, despite the correction is issued. Yet when they asked directly about the main cause of the fire, the majority of participants, 75%, did not mention the chemicals. In addition, over 90% of the subjects also accurately recalled the correction. What's interesting, therefore, is that despite this explicit awareness of correction, the misinformation virus had already infected other memory representations of the event. For example, when asked what might have caused the toxic fumes, some participants mentioned burning paint. Similarly, when inquired about why the fire might have been so intense and difficult to put out, answers included oil fires are hard to put out. For what reason might an insurance claim be refused? Because flammable items were not kept in a safe place. In other words, although participants were clearly aware that the cause of the fire was not the chemical materials, misinformation had already started to take root in their memory. Participants were relying on misinformation when asked about the event. Jury trials are helpful context in which to understand this phenomenon. Imagine that false media reports are widely circulated about a defendant, and the judge orders the jury to disregard what they have heard, despite being sequestered. As much as we would like to, the continued influence of misinformation makes it hard to use information when forming judgments once we've committed it to memory. In fact, judges and courts were keenly aware of this fact over 100 years ago. In 1912, using a wonderfully apt analogy that you cannot unring a bell, the Oregon Supreme Court concluded the following when referring to an improper testimony during an arson trial. While in some cases, an express instruction to the jury to disregard testimony injuriously admitted to is properly held to cure the error, yet the courts are cautious in the application of this rule. It is not easy task to unring a bell, nor to remove from the mind an impression once firmly imprinted there. Studies with mock jurors have shown that despite clear instructions to do so, inadmissible information is rarely disregarded by the jury when making verdicts. More generally, the continued influence of misinformation has demonstrated across a wide variety of issues, not just fires in warehouses. A recent meta-analysis, a study which pooled findings from many individual experiments, looked at 32 experiments involving over 6,000 people across 4 decades and found evidence for a modest but consistent continued influence effect. In other words, when we look at this effect across many people and situations, we find that corrections do help reduce misinformation, but they do not fully eliminate it. People continue to retrieve false details from memory once exposed to a falsehood. The effect appears to get more pronounced the more misinformation is repeated and the longer it is held in memory without correction. The infection worsens. Of course, finding illicit under controlled laboratory conditions are one thing. What about evidence from the continued influence of misinformation in the real world? The virus lives on. In 2016, the conspiracy movie Vaxxed, From the Cover-Up to Catastrophe, was scheduled to be released during New York's Tribeca Film Festival with the support of actor Robert De Niro. The film's director was Andrew Wakefield, a discredited British anti-vaccination activist who lost his medical license in 2010 due to ethical violations. To understand why he lost his license, we need to go back to 1998 when Wakefield and his colleagues published a paper in the highly prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, claiming that based on his case study of 12 children and no control group, they had discovered a link between the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella, Vaccine and Autism. This paper became arguably one of the most serious frauds in the history of medicine. Specifically, the paper concluded that we have identified a chronic enterocolitis in children that may be related to neuropsychiatric dysfunction. In most cases, the onset of symptoms was after measles, mumps, or rubella immunization. In other words, he's using this a lot in this chapter. In other words, after receiving the MMR vaccine, children supposedly experience gastrointestinal inflammation, and this is somehow related to the onset of autism. However, Wakefield failed to disclose was that the patients had been recruited by a compensation lawyer as part of an effort to file lawsuits against MMR manufacturers. Wakefield received hundreds of thousands of pounds in compensation for his work, all undisclosed. Moreover, some of the children in the study did not actually have autism diagnosis, and despite the claims that the children were neurotypical, almost half had pre-existing developmental issues. As a gastroenterologist, Wakefield specifically focused on the gut and link in his paper, coining a new condition called autistic enterocolitis. His idea was that the vaccine somehow damaged the intestinal lining, which supposedly caused colitis, which in turn impacted brain development. Yet 11 of the 12 children had normal colonoscopy results, which were later changed to non-specific colitis or general inflammation of the colon by the authors themselves to justify a link between bowel inflammation and the MMR vaccine and autism. In short, the case study was fraudulent. I don't believe that. Subsequent reviews of the medical literature and Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and American Academy of Pediatrics, and National Academy of Science, NAS, and UK National Health Service, NHS, and the World Health Organization have absolutely found no evidence for a link between autism and vaccination. Look, let me tell you about all these government names that he mentioned in his book. Just on our Federal Register alone, with NIH, the National Institute of Health, they lying about a whole government invention, just as clear as day on December 6, 2023. Go look it up for yourself, saying that government invention had to do with children and prenatal care and heart monitor rates of prenatal and all that. And it's a scam. It's a whole scam. So who's to say that their information is correct? Huh? Moreover, by 2004, 10 out of the original 13 authors had already issued a retraction notice, and no other team around the world has been able to replicate the results. Unfortunately, it wasn't until 2010, almost 12 years after original publication, that the Lancet officially retracted the bogus paper, with the journal's editor-in-chief describing it as utterly false. Wakefield was struck off of the medical register after having been found guilty of misconduct in the UK's General Medical Council, who concluded that he abused his position and acted without ethics approval and was callous in disregard for the well-being of children in the study. But 12 years is a very long time for continued influence of misinformation to fester. Although the incubation period for the misinformation pathogens is recently unknown and probably quite variable, I think it's safe to say that 12 years is more than sufficient to do some serious damage. Indeed, parents grew increasingly concerned about the safety of the MMR vaccine. The misinformation not only affected their attitudes, but also their actions. Vaccine coverage in UK dropped to its lowest point since the vaccine was introduced in 1988. Specifically, coverage decreased from about 92% in the years prior to Wakefield paper, 1995 through 1996, to 80% in 2003 through 2004, with drops as low as 58% in some areas such as London. Well, below the recommended 90%, no, that was well below the recommended 90% coverage level required for herd immunity. As a consequence, the number of measles cases in UK rose sharply. And although rates had improved in recent years, they still haven't fully recovered to pre-scare levels. Of course, the casual relationship between the conclusions of the paper itself and the public health outcomes isn't entirely direct. For example, the media has played an important mediating role in amplifying the paper's false conclusions. Long after Wakefield's paper had been discredited, the media continued to adhere to norms of false balance, that is, representing an issue as having two sides, despite the overwhelming scientific consensus. For example, national surveys in 2002 revealed that over half of the UK population thought that there is equal evidence on both sides of the debate. About a third of the population reported that they would follow Wakefield's televised recommendation to get 3 separate vaccines instead of one single MMR shot. And 67% of the public reported awareness of a potential link between autism and MMR vaccine. The ensuring vaccine hesitancy also spilled over to the United States, where coverage of MMR vaccine has generally been closer to the 90% target. Yet in 2011, at least 15 states had immunization coverage below 90%, and some national surveys reveal about 30% of the parents with young children, young children mistakenly believe their vaccines cause autism. The states also witnessed a resurgence of measles outbreaks and otherwise preventable disease, due in part to growing vaccine hesitancy and refusal. In several studies I've conducted since 2015, my colleagues, his alter egos, and I found that the false belief that vaccines can cause autism is still strong predictor of people's attitude towards vaccinating their children. Back to Robert De Niro. In the period following the scandal, Wakefield doubled down on his media profile as a prominent voice in the anti-vaccination movement by directing a conspiracy movie, Vaxxed. De Niro, who co-founded the Tribeca Film Festival, initially supported the film in 2016 before eventually pulling it. The question is why? To understand this, we need to bring back the role of pre-existing worldviews and motivations. Robert De Niro has a child with autism. In response to the controversy surrounding the festival's planned screening of Vaxxed, De Niro commented on Facebook, "Grace and I have a child with autism, and we believe it is critical that all of the issues surrounding the causes of autism be openly discussed and examined." The observational equivalence paradox strikes again. Was De Niro honestly motivated by the search for accuracy and truth and just poorly informed about the movie's agenda? Or were his opinions distorted by deep-seated personal desire to understand the world in a certain way? Although De Niro clarified that he is not anti-vax and did not personally endorse the film, many people were rightly outraged that such an influential celebrity was given a platform to what was essentially a baseless conspiracy movie. Although he was ultimately pulled from the festival, this did not stop its continued influence. It received a private screening the following year during 2017 Cannes Film Festival. And shortly afterward, another public figure, Robert Kennedy Jr., served as an executive producer on the sequel, Vax 2, The People's Truth, 2019. The misinformation virus lives on. Vaccination isn't the only example of how misinformation continues to influence people many years later. Another illustrative case are the many false reports around the alleged existence of weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq following the events of 9/11. Both Bush and Blair administrators suggested that Saddam Hussein was secretly hiding nuclear weapons. Initial reports often followed suit, suggesting that weapons of mass destruction could be present, only to be repeatedly corrected and disconfirmed later. For example, one New York Times headline from 2001 announced, Iraqi tells of renovations as site for chemical and nuclear arms. Other headlines claim what the weapons of mass destruction had been found. No evidence of weapons of mass destruction was ever found on these sites. In 2004, the New York Times issued a public apology for its coverage of the war, concluding that we consider the story of Iraq's weapons and of the pattern of misinformation to be unfinished business, and we fully intend to continue aggressive reporting aimed at setting the record straight. Let's set the record straight. Although the public apology and effort to set the record straight is certainly laudable, much of the damage had already been done. A study of Stephen Lewandowski nicely illustrated this effect several years later. Steve and his colleagues asked around 900 people whether a number of statements about Iraq war were true or false. Participants were recruited from countries that were allies in the war, including Australia and the United States, as well as countries such as Germany, whose media coverage was consistently skeptical of the motives of war for the war. They asked about 3 categories of statements. Some were deemed true, some that are initially presented as true but subsequently retracted. For example, Allied prisoners of war were executed by Iraqis after being captured, and others were completely fictional. Participants were first asked to report on their memory of all statements in the study and whether they thought the statements were true or false. Later in the survey, people were presented with the same items again and asked how certain they were that particular claim had later been retracted. The main idea is that if people were open to corrections and misinformation, then acknowledgement of having seen the retraction of false claim should lead people to be less likely to rate false items as true. The results, all across the country samples, revealed that whether people thought a particular claim was true or not was strongly predicted by how well they recalled the initial claim. Remember that for false items specifically, we would expect the knowledge of retractions should matter so that people are less likely to endorse false statements for which they remembered having seen a retraction notice. Interestingly, this pattern was confirmed in all countries except the United States, where awareness of these retractions had absolutely no effect on participants' truth ratings of the false claims. This next finding is more suggestive. When asked about the motive behind the war, U.S. participants rated the to destroy weapons of mass destruction explanation as the most important reason, whereas this motive was of little importance to Australia and German respondents. In other words, Americans had a stronger prior motivation to latch onto the weapons of mass destruction narrative, even in the face of explicit corrections. The takeaway here is that not only does misinformation linger despite repeated corrections, it does so more easily when misinformation fits with what people want to be true about the world. The true To truly understand the powerful role that prior beliefs can play in continuation of misinformation, let's return to the example that motivated the opening of this chapter: Nazi propaganda, one of the most extensive and concerted real world attempts to indoctrinate millions of people with disinformation. During the Third Reich, the entire German school curriculum, as well as many extracurricular activities, was harnessed in the service of Nazi ideology. Young Germans were forced to join the Hitler Youth Movement, whose handbook devoted more than half of its page to racial ideology, which was further reinforced in books, films, and adverts. In 2015, two researchers set out to determine the effects of Nazi propaganda on the modern-day beliefs about Jews some 50 years after the war. The researchers looked at two waves of the German General Social Survey, an important national poll of social attitudes, the Beatitudes, which, among many other topics, asked 5,000 people 7 questions. Which, among many other topics, asked 5,000 people 7 questions about attitudes towards Jews across 264 German cities, once in 1996 and then again 10 years later in 2006. The combined data shows that about 17% of Germans thought that Jews themselves were to blame for their own persecution. And about that, Jews themselves were to blame for their own persecution. And about 22% still believe that Jews should not have equal rights. These numbers are shocking. But notably, the national averages mask large regional variation in endorsements of these beliefs. For example, the percentage of population who believe that Jews should not have equal rights dropped 10% in Hamburg, but rose about half the population, 48% of Lower Bavaria. Next, the researchers identified a narrower group of what they call committed anti-Semites. This group answered strongly and in affirmative to the following 3 questions specifically about Jewish people: whether they are responsible for their own persecution, whether they have too much influence in the world, and whether they exploit their victim status for financial gain. Although the absolute incidence rate of extremists in the sample was quite low, like 4%, the authors found that there were clear generational trends. On average, younger Germans were found to be less anti-Semitic, specifically individuals born in the 1930s, who were 2 to 3 times more likely to be anti-Semitic than those born later in the century. This finding remains stable when taking into account other factors such as the levels of education and perception of the economy. In final part of the study, the authors wondered what could have caused these attitudes. Combining historic voting data with survey responses for all 264 sites offered some interesting potential explanations. For example, Nazi indoctrination appears to have been particularly effective in regions with a history of voting for anti-Semitic parties. Looking at the share of the vote that anti-Semitic parties won in each region between 1890 and 1912, the researchers found that regions that ranked in the top third showed 4 times the share of committed anti-Semites in 2006 than did the regions in the bottom third. This suggested that the Nazis' propaganda had been especially effective on those populations who already harbored anti-Semitic sentiments in ways that persist to this day. The author's statistical model confirmed that the effect of propaganda or growing up under Nazi regime on voting for Nazi parties was influential, even in the regions with no prior anti-Semitic history. However, the effect of propaganda was further enhanced if people had already had negative views towards Jews. Nazi propaganda was able to persist for so long in the German population because it had efficiently tapped into pre-existing prejudices, thus reinforcing Goebbels' original hypothesis that propaganda can only be truly effective if it is in the line with people's pre-existing attitude. Why the virus won't leave your brain? Why does the influence of misinformation continue? Prior motivations aren't the only explanation. Listen, you got motives and intention. I hear a train passing right now. That's a locomotive action. Motive is something you're already moving into. Intention is something that sits and it's already, it's a tense sense, not moving forward or backwards in emotion, but something that's just intentionally pulling at you to make a move. I don't know. I'm just breaking down motives and intentions since it's all in this book right now. Prior motivations aren't the only explanation for the continued influence effect. Although we don't yet know all of the factors that can fully account for why people continue to retrieve false information from memory, we do know that misinformation and corrections coexist in our brains and compete with each other for attention. One example is rooted in what we call the selective retrieval model, selective recall. According to this theory, accurate information and misinformation are stored in our memory simultaneously. And when a correction is issued, the misinformation is automatically activated but not properly suppressed. This can happen when people are not paying sufficient attention to the correction or discount the correction because it happens to conflict with their personal beliefs. The alternative, model updating account or integration account, assumes that, like good Bayesians, like good Bayesians, people have a mental model of how something works and update it as new information because it becomes available. But something goes wrong in linking the correction to the misinformation. When misinformation is corrected without being replaced by credible alternative explanation, it leaves a gap in people's mental model. Let me repeat that. When misinformation is corrected without being replaced by a credible alternative explanation, this leaves a gap in people's mental model. For example, think back to the warehouse fire scenario. If the fire wasn't started by paint cans, then what could have started it? In the absence of clear alternative explanation, the theory goes that people prefer to stick with coherent yet incorrect model over the incoherent but correct mental model. The latest research has tried to probe what is going on in the brain when we experience a continued influence of misinformation. Use a scenario very similar to the warehouse fire example. Researchers from the University of Western Australia asked 26 healthy volunteers to undergo functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, or a brain scan while listening to narratives that either featured a retraction or not. Although there was no overall increase in neural activity, whether the information was presented as reaction or not did appear to matter for how the information was encoded in the brain. For example, God, he uses for example so much in this book. For example, Participants would see a story about evacuation of a plane. In the misinformation condition, they were told that the plane evacuation was due to a fire, whereas in a control group, they were given no information about its cause at all. A later sentence would then explicitly correct the misinformation for all by stating that there was no evidence of a fire. This allowed the researchers to test whether early exposure to the misinformation that the crash was caused by a fire impeded processing of the correction. The authors found that the retractions elicited less activity in the right precuneus and area of the occipital lobe. Do you know where the occipital lobe is? If you watch the Messiah Code, you take your hand over your ear, the occipital, right here, right around. You know where your occipital is? Learn the parts of your body. Because the brain region has previously been implicated in memory processes and difficulties integrating information is happening. The authors conclude that basic integration of coherence mechanisms are less active when new information challenges people's previous understanding of an event that requires encoding, consistent with the model updated explanation. Of course, it's good to keep in mind that the study only included 26 volunteers and not the whole world, right? And initial support for one account doesn't rule out other plausible theories. In fact, a follow-up study from the same research team suggests that problem also likely stems from the challenge of having to hold both correct and incorrect information in memory concurrently, which is more aligned with the selective retrieval model. Although these distinctions matter for our understanding of how misinformation impacts the brain, particularly, the implications are clear either way. Both theories suggest that if you are to correct false information, it is especially prudent to make the correction stand out relative to the misinformation to avoid accidentally strengthening people's memory of myth rather than the correction. In addition, it's important to offer a credible, they forgot to put it's important to offer a credible alternative causal explanation for the events to replace the gap in people's mental model. For example, subsequent studies of how many times does he use for example in this? For example, subsequent studies of the classic warehouse fire experiments have shown that if people are made aware of an alternative case of a fire involving lighter fluid and an accelerant, they are less likely to retrieve false explanations involving the paint and the gas cans. Similarly, returning to our jury verdict analogy, studies with fictional murder trials have shown that compared to defense strategies which merely attempt to explain why the defendant isn't guilty, accusing a plausible alternative suspect of murder reduced the number of guilty verdicts to a much greater degree, correcting misinformation without continuing its influence. Yet, given the potential role of prior motivations, a simple alternative isn't always enough. It would therefore be ideal if the alternative explanation doesn't explicitly conflict with people's pre-existing beliefs. This principle is well known in social media companies. In 2020, I helped Facebook design their Climate Mythbuster Information Center. Oh, wow. Okay. So he works with Facebook. I told y'all, Sandra Vender Linden. I told you. In 2020, I helped Facebook design their Climate Mythbuster Information Center. As part of this new effort, Facebook algorithm now tags posts related to climate change, including misinformation. In particular, Facebook uses what they call neutral information treatments, NITs, to connect people with factual information about climate change. For example, if a user posts misinformation about climate change, Facebook will tag the post with a label that says, "See how the average temperature in your area is changing. Explore climate science." This NIT avoids challenging the user too directly and encourages others who may be exposed to misinformation to visit the information hub, where credible scientific explanations can be found. One Facebook post our team designed informs people about the scientific consensus of climate change. The fact that over 97% of the climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. This is based on our own academic research, where we found that emphasizing scientific consensus can be a powerful way to avoid having to repeat influential information. Although debunking, although I'm twisted and tied up and all. Although debunking influential climate myths has been a step in the right direction for Facebook, unfortunately, repeating misinformation remains a common practice in the mainstream media. Poorly crafted fact checks often repeat aspects of the misinformation in an attempt to debunk them, which could inadvertently strengthen memory associations that people hold with myth in question. For instance, the statement, "vaccines do not cause autism," may just strengthen the association people have between the word vaccine and autism. In one experiment, our team exposed people to a post stating that over 90% of medical scientists agree that approved vaccines are safe and that parents should vaccinate their children. We didn't mention or repeat false autism link at all. Importantly, we found that compared to the control group who received no information, treatment group participants were significantly and substantially less likely to believe the false autism vaccination link. Specifically, endorsement was just about 30% lower in the treatment group. Of course, it isn't always possible to provide credible alternative explanation on an issue, and sometimes you have to repeat a false claim in order to correct it. So, if you're forced to debunk, better do it right. Right. With about 24 other misinformation experts, we've come up with a format on how to debunk effectively. It's an approach Berkeley linguistics professor George Lakoff refers to as truth sandwich. Oh, sand cheesy. The truth sandwich. The idea is to layer the falsehood with truth in both opening as well as the ending of a fact check, which should include an alternative exclamation or explanation for the myth. The meat of the sandwich should consist of explaining why the myth is misleading without repeating it. Let's go. Facts. Lead with the facts. Make them simple and sticky using expert sources. Warn about the myth. Warn your audience about the myth just once. Expose the manipulation technique. Explain how and why the myth is misleading. And it says, e.g., conspiracy theory. Facts. End by reinforcing the facts along with the credible alternative explanation. Effective debunking, the truth sandwich. Ultimately, debunking only stands a chance if setting the record straight. Ultimately, debunking only stands a chance of setting the record straight if people share the corrected information widely enough. If misinformation continues to circulate in a high rate, this will only boost its familiarity and might therefore simply reinforce the continued influence effect, which leads to our next question. How does misinformation spread online? Oh my goodness. Fake news antigen 4 minimize the continued influence of misinformation. Once exposed, misinformation is difficult to correct because it takes root in our memories and continues to influence our judgments, even when we are aware of a correction. The longer misinformation sits in our brains and the more it coheres with people's pre-existing beliefs, the more influential it can become and the more difficult it can be to correct. For example, despite repeated corrections, some people would continue to believe that vaccines cause autism and weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq and that Jews were to blame for the Second World War. A timely correction that provides a credible alternative without repeating the myth might have some chance of reducing people's continued reliance on misinformation. That is the end of chapter 4, part 1. I have finished part 1 in FoolProof. Did I even finish part 1 in The Righteous Mind or get to part 2? I'm in part 2 already. Infodemic, how misinformation virus spreads. I will continue this tomorrow. I'm going to go ahead and sign off for a few because I'm going to come back with another live. I'd like to keep this separate. This FoolProof separate, Righteous Mind separate, and my Bible separate. So I'm going to come back later with some living word. What's the living word? You are the living word. Everything that comes from you is word. Your word is bond. Your word is what keeps you going or coming. Your word is how you move. When you first wake up, your first thought is your word. What makes you decide how you're going to move throughout the day. And before you go to sleep, your last thought is your word. Within your dreams, some of you hear words in your dreams. Some hear songs in your dreams. Some people say they don't dream at all. But the living word is inside your temple. Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Hey there, Latrell Tinwell, Greater Light. Good to see you over here. You got the play button going on? What's the play? You got a play button going on, You want to come up? You want to express yourself? You need to get up on the panel. You need somewhere to vent. You done vented all over the place. You need to invent yourself. No? Oh, you done dropped off that quick, That quick. Oh, you already know, You didn't even say grand awakening or greater light. You want to say play. Play what? You play. You play. Greater light. Latrell Tinwell. President. Governor. Greater light, Latrell Tinwell. If that's you. Could be. Who's to say? Sound like Color Purple up in here. Who's to say? But again, I'm going to come back in a little bit. That's enough of FoolProof. I got a lot of discrediting to do with FoolProof, with Sander Linden. He helps shape human behavior. That's what they said about him. Artificial intelligence said, and the government uses him as the head psychological source. He helps shape human behavior through online. through technology. This book that I'm reading right here, this demon, huh? Yes, he helped shape human behavior. Sander Vender Linden. If you would like, you could go and look him up, or you could go to the hour-long about the author that I did when I looked him up, huh? To know what I'm dealing with as I read. I told you I do that. I investigate. If I meet somebody and I'm interested in them, believe me, by the second time they done talked to me, I already done looked up your background, huh? And if I'm still talking to you, it's something I see. Because I want to know who I'm dealing with. If I'm going to be transparent, my whole life is online, huh? As transparent as I done been. Who could play games with the truth? You can't handle the truth. Can you handle the truth? The truth is in you. You are the living word of God, huh? What this man trying to do to the world? I'm trying to figure out what he doing to people online, huh? Where the sleeping coming in, the misinformation coming from the government. He helps the government form. UK, the Queen and them, they all resort to this Sander Vender Linden. Alexander, huh? The Linden tree. Elon Musk calls him for advice. Mark Zuckerberg calls this man for advice. All the top notch Rothschilds, all them. What's his name? What's their name for Microsoft? All them. This Sander Vender Linden, they come to him for psychological. The Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, they all look to him, huh? And other people, but he sit at the round table. Sander Vender Linden. Why you think I'm reading this book, huh? Talking about foolproof, huh? And then he want to mention names like B.O.B., huh? And Neil deGrasse Tyson. I told y'all when I kept going in picking at Neil deGrasse Tyson. The last time I messed with Neil deGrasse Tyson was when him and Joe Budden did it might be in one of my lives somewhere, one of them 1,000 videos, him and Joe Budden. Joe Budden, huh? I could see him and Snoop Dogg. Snoop Dogg IQ higher than Elon Musk. Him and Joe Budden, huh? Panelizing together. And then he debating and writing songs, debating B.O.B. And then Sander Vender Linden want to write about it in his book. He artificial intelligence lying. Huh? Talking about all his colleagues, his alter egos. That's all his alter egos. Ain't nothing. Yeah, his alter egos. The next chapter, or the next, the next chapter, chapter 5, he says all roads lead to Rome. Look, misinformation pathogens from ancient Rome to social media. I should continue reading. It's getting good. Because this chapter 4 was boring. There was a lot of, for example, and Robert De Niro. Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. Anytime I think Robert De Niro, I automatically think Devil's Advocate. Why every time I think Robert De Niro, Al Pacino pop up in the scene in my mind? Now I'm ready. I'm gonna finish this book before the month out. I'm gonna finish this book before the month out. But y'all see some of the techniques that people use. Saying cheesy, I'm pretty sure uses the truth sandwich. Who is saying cheesy? Latrell Tinwell, put it in the chat. Who I call saying cheesy? Oh, you scared? Huh? You don't want to mention no names. You don't want to be triggered, huh? Greater light. Let me get off of here so I can get back to the living word. I'm gonna come back to the living word. All right, get some knowledge. Sander Vender Linden, go look him up. This is the man that all the people sit at the round table and listen to, because they say he shaped. Artificial intelligence says that he shapes human behavior. He shapes. It doesn't say help shape, motivate to shape. None of that. It says he shapes human behavior. Sander Vender Linden. Not here. Not here. Hey, y'all is. I'm coming back. I'm going to drop off. Get ready for my living word.